Bonjour, good morning. Sorry to interrupt your breakfast and the conversation that are taking place right now, but we have to start because we promise our parliamentarian friends that we end these events by 8:45. That's a promise we want to keep. So, mon nom est Jean-Marc Mangin, je suis le directeur général de la Fédération des sciences humaines et je suis ravi de vous voir ici ce matin, ce beau matin de printemps. La Fédération est la voix nationale des 90 000 chercheurs en sciences humaines partout au pays, au sein de 160 universités et sociétés savantes du Canada. Our Big Thinking Lecture Series helps bring parliamentarians and our leading thinkers to bring research and new ideas to Parliament, to inform public policy. Et je souhaite remercier M. Greg Fergus, député de Hall-Elmer, de parrainer cette série. C'est grâce à lui que nous avons accès à ce fantastique restaurant du Parlement. We also want to thank the Social Science Humanities Research Council for the continued support to this series. Si vous avez besoin d'une traduction simultanée, parce que l'événement va se tenir surtout en anglais ce matin, les détails sont sur votre table et nous avons des écouteurs à la réception. 2017 is fast approaching, and the Canadian government has made and is making important decisions on how to commemorate the significant milestone. 2017 raises fundamental questions about what is Canada and the Canada we want to be. And we are privileged to hear this morning an ambitious proposal for how we can use this opportunity to reset Canada's origin story. As an important aside, I learned this morning that our speaker is a member of the board of the Canadian Red Cross. And as we saw in the very generous response of Canadians over the last week, we are open to what happened to our fellow Canadians, and the human story, to the tragedy, but also the resilience, the stories of survival. So these values of humanities, resilience, collaboration of humanity, I think are very much at the core of what we're going to hear about this morning. But to formally introduce our speaker, I'm pleased that we have partnered this morning with the Royal Society of Canada. By recognizing academic and artistic excellence and advising Canadians on matters of public interest, the Royal Society promotes both learning and research in the arts, the humanities, and the natural and social sciences. Je veux maintenant inviter Madame Malice Lalonde, présidente de la Société royale du Canada, à présenter notre conférencière.
Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. I'm honored to be here today as President of the Royal Society of Canada, and I am delighted with the partnership that we have with the Federation, and I hope that this will continue in the future. If you'll allow me, before I present our distinguished speaker, I would like to acknowledge the presence of several people who are members of our council, and I'd like them to stand up. And we also have some staff members from the Royal Society of Canada, so please so that we can identify you, if you could stand up for a second. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker for today's Big Thinking lecture, Professor Mahoney, who is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Our distinguished speaker is a professor of law at the University of Calgary, specializing in human rights. She was the chief negotiator of the Assembly of First Nations, achieving the historic Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement for the abuses perpetrated on Indian children for over 150 years. Additionally, she was the primary architect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and led the negotiations for the historic apology from the Canadian Parliament and from Pope Benedict XVI at the Vatican. She has had many awards and distinctions, and I don't want to cut on her presentation time, so I will briefly mention a few of them. Professor Mahoney was appointed Queen's Counsel. She is a Trudeau Fellow. From Harvard, she became a Human Rights Fellow and a Fulbright Fellow. She also received the Governor General Medal in recognition of her work advancing gender equality. So this morning, Professor Mahoney will aim to reset Canada's origin story so that future generations will better understand the true nature of the country's origin. Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, please welcome Professor Mahoney.
I wonder if somebody that knows how to put this up, could come and do it for me, please. Okay. Okay, and it needs to be on slideshow. So from the beginning. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Madam President. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the Algonquin people upon whose territory we are holding this breakfast meeting, and say thank you especially to the parliamentarians who have taken some time to come here this morning and others, and giving me the honor of speaking to you today. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the sponsors, the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences, and of course the Royal Society. So, as you can see, the title of my talk is Roadblock to Reconciliation, Canada's Origin Story. Now, this first slide portrays the theme of my lecture, Canada Hiding from the Truth. My talk today is about looking at the truth, especially as we approach the 150th anniversary of Confederation. In 2017, as no doubt all of you are very aware, we will be reflecting upon how Canada was founded, how it developed, and what our values are. Canada's origin story will likely be the starting point of most conversations. And as the story goes, Canada was founded by two peoples, the British and the French, who created a constitution in 1867 that formed the bedrock of our Canadian identity and the basis for our evolution into what most Canadians like to believe is a caring, sharing, and peaceable nation, a nation that practices equality, and more recently, a nation that loves sunny days and sunny ways. But here's the problem. This origin story is not true. It was never true. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples wrote in its report, "A country cannot be built on a living lie." After 150 years in denial, coming to terms with our true origin story is long overdue. Recognition that Indigenous peoples were founders of the nation must be explicitly and legally recognized. Doing so will provide the truth for reconciliation and a solid foundation upon which Indigenous peoples in Canada can found a meaningful nation-to-nation relationship. In support of this proposal, I will discuss four themes this morning. First, the importance of origin stories and how Canada's story is wrong. Second, the legal and philosophical justifications for denying recognition. Third, the deep and lasting harms caused by Canada's flawed origin story. And finally, the relationship between the origin story and reconciliation. Now, origin stories are important. Every country, every community, every family has a story of origin to express who they are and where they have come from. Connecting our past to the present and explaining its relevance to everyday life is important for our identity, and it helps us to navigate our world. When origin stories describe the beginnings of politics and power, they serve as scripts for citizenship, a form of consent to a political vision. A society with no stories, or stories that exclude some of its members, create alienation and disaffection, like denying a person their name or a family its roots. For the past several years, our country has gone through a painful existential crisis. The apology in Parliament and the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission revealed shocking facts contradicting many commonly held beliefs about Canada, its values, and what it means to be Canadian. The disconnect between our comfortable origin stories and the cultural genocide of Indigenous Canadians that went on for almost 2 centuries is traumatizing. The great American writer James Baldwin's insight that people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them, I think captures our existential dilemma. Canada's commonly understood story of origin provides that our country came into being on the 1st of July, 1867, founded by 36 fathers of Confederation, representing 2 colonial powers, the British and the French. The Constitution they drafted is known as the British North America Act. This act set out the governance structure for the new country, including the protection of languages, cultures, and civil rights, but only for the British and the French. As time passed, more provinces joined Confederation, and Canada welcomed immigrants from backgrounds other than the British and the French, so multiculturalism was added to the origin story. Parliament passed legislation recognizing multiculturalism, characterizing it as essential to our Canadian heritage. The fundamental character of the country, however, was and still is defined as bicultural. In 1963, for example, Prime Minister Lester Pearson convened the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. In its introduction, the report of the Commission says, and I'm quoting, "The Commission will not examine the question of the Indians and the Eskimos, since it is obvious that those 2 groups do not form part of the founding races. It would logically be necessary," it continued, "to include them under the heading other ethnic groups." In other words, understanding Canada as the product of anything other than British and French founders was unthinkable, and Indigenous peoples disappeared into an undifferentiated ethnic group. This begs the question, why have Indigenous peoples been made invisible in this origin story? They were present on the land for thousands of years. Prior to Confederation, and without their contributions to Canada, Canada would not be the country it is today. There were hundreds of self-determining Indigenous nations, as different from one another as the European nations were, with distinct cultures, laws, and unique knowledge and understanding of this part of the world, to say nothing of their distinct languages. When the settlers came, Indigenous nations provided land, entered into trade agreements and peace and friendship treaties, and actually fought alongside of the colonial powers in colonial wars. The fur trade, the mainstay of colonial economies for more than 250 years, opened the continent to exploration and settlement, missionary work, and social and other economic development. Were it not for the Indigenous hunters, trappers, oarsmen, and traders, the fur trade and the colonial project would have failed miserably. But by far the most significant contribution of Indigenous nations to the building of the Canadian nation were the treaties negotiated with the Crown for vast tracts of land needed to make the country what it is today. Now, I want you to take a moment to appreciate the vast areas of land we are talking about, lands that have produced immense riches, making Canada one of the wealthiest nations in the world. The colored portions indicate land ceded to Canada by treaties with Indigenous nations, land that was the subject of legal agreements, most notably the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This was Canada's first constitutional document. The proclamation set the legal foundation for the Crown-Indigenous relationship, especially with respect to land rights, treaties, and also the right of self-determination. The Royal Proclamation explicitly states that Aboriginal title has existed and continues to exist, and that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. The proclamation itself was incorporated into the 1982 Constitution Act and is still the law today. And yet, once Britain gained effective control over North America in 1812, it ignored these legal obligations. Large tracts of Indigenous lands were appropriated to house settlers' ever-increasing demands, and Indians were moved on to reserves. The nation-to-nation relationship embedded in the proclamation was abandoned. It should therefore come as no surprise that at the Confederation table in 1867, there were no chairs for Indigenous representatives. No one asked them if they wanted to be British subjects or Canadian citizens, or what they may have wanted that citizenship to look like. Yet the decisions taken by these fathers of Confederation had profound implications for them from that day forward, July the 1st. Instead of respecting the nation-to-nation relationship, the fathers of Confederation decided that the federal government would have total control over, quote, Indians and land reserved for the Indians. No protection for Indigenous languages, education, laws, or cultures were in the BNA Act. Those guarantees applied only to the British and the French, allowing their cultures to flourish ever since. After Confederation, things got even worse. Indigenous peoples were herded onto smaller and smaller reserves to make way for more and more settlers and resource development. Today, Indigenous peoples occupy only 0.2% of the land mass of Canada. The land and resources taken from Indigenous nations without compensation or consent formed the foundation for the high quality of life enjoyed by other Canadians from then on. Only a small portion of resource income has ever come back to Indigenous peoples, usually in the form of transfer payments for social welfare. Sealing the deal on systemic discrimination was the passage of the first Indian Act in 1876, just a few years after Confederation, when just about every aspect of life of the Indigenous population came under the control of the federal bureaucracy. For example, the Indian Act, among other things, prohibited Indians from hiring lawyers to fight for their land rights. It forbade the raising of funds to organize politically. It mandated attendance at Indian residential schools. It confined Indians to their reserves. It criminalized cultural activities. It took Indian status away from those who attended universities. It imposed alien forms of government. It redefined gender roles and denied them the right to vote, amongst many other things. Apparently, it struck no one as improper to hand the control of an entire race to a branch of the federal bureaucracy. So how did this happen? Of course, none of this was done without some legal and philosophical justification. The two most important justifications were the discovery doctrine and the formal equality principle. The doctrine of discovery originated in 1493 in the papal bull of Alexander VI. The doctrine became the legal tool through which Europeans claimed ownership of property and sovereignty over regions they claimed to discover. That meant Indigenous peoples could not own their own lands. They could only occupy and use the lands. The other justification for discrimination was the formal equality principle. It comes from the teaching of Plato and Aristotle, and they understood equality to mean that people who were the same were to be treated the same, and people who were different could be treated differently. The standard of comparison, which is critically important to the application of this principle, was set by those in power, so that in Athenian society, for example, those seeking power had to be comparable to elite male landowners. Common men, slaves and women, were not comparable, so access to power for them was out of the question. As long as they were treated the same as the others in their class, the equality requirements were met. Plato and Aristotle would approve. Now, the fathers of Confederation adopted both the formal equality principle and the doctrine of discovery. The two principles acting together ensured perpetual domination of the British and the French founders and the permanent subordination of the Indigenous founders. They couldn't own land because of the discovery principle, and they could be treated differently because they were different. The formal equality principle easily justified the Indian Act, for example, because Indians were not the same as non-Indians. As long as the Indian Act treated all Indians the same, the Act met the formal equality standards. Now, the flip side of formal equality is assimilation. Assimilation is seen as a solution to the problem of difference. And in the Canadian context, as the colonial settlements grew, Indians were seen as more and more of a problem that needed fixing through forced assimilation. The most egregious example, of course, of assimilation was the Indian residential school policy. The fact that government policy treated Indian children differently by destroying their family bonds, their languages and cultures, and ultimately their identities, as compared to non-native children, would not have raised eyebrows or created alarm bells. The difference made it okay. As long as all Indian children were treated the same, insofar as schooling was concerned, the problem of difference was being addressed through assimilation, and that was a good thing. Now, this man's name was Nicholas Flood Davin, and he was a member of Parliament. He wrote the Davin Report of 1879, shortly after Confederation. And in this report, he explicitly dictated the assimilation policy. And in the report, it says that government must carry out the Indian residential school policy, and I'm quoting, until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. Now, this man is Duncan Campbell Scott. He was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, and he was in charge of implementing the policy. He went so far as to refuse to close down certain schools where up to 43% of the children in them were dying from tuberculosis. He said, and I'm quoting, "The death rate does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem." End of quote. Now, this man, his name was Dr. P.H. Bryce. He was a physician, and his responsibility was to investigate the health of Indian children in the residential schools. He tried to expose what Campbell Scott was doing, and when the federal government refused to make his report public, he wrote this book titled A National Crime, and it was one of the few publications of the time that condemned the Indian residential school policy. Now, ironically, Duncan Campbell Scott was named a Confederation poet, and embarrassingly to me, and I'm sure my colleagues here, was a member of the Royal Society of Canada. The Government of Canada's official biography of him says that Campbell Scott's widely recognized and valued Indian poems, which lamented the disappearance of the Indians, cemented his literary reputation. Finally, in 1989, it took that long, the formal equality theory was firmly overruled by the Supreme Court of Canada in a famous case called Andrews and the Law Society of British Columbia. The court said in that case that the concept more often than not perpetuates inequality and in fact could have justified Hitler's Nuremberg laws. The discovery doctrine, too, has been widely discredited as socially unjust, racist, a concept in violation of the fundamental Indigenous human rights. Had the British and the French, fathers of Confederation, not been so misguided by assimilationist values, formal equality, and the doctrine of discovery, we would not now be trapped, as I see it, in the narrow framework of an origin story that has left Indigenous Canadians marginalized, dispossessed, and unrecognized, and the rest of us intellectually debilitated, morally disempowered, and personally depressed, wondering who we really are. So where does this leave us? There was the Oka crisis. There was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. There was the Idle No More movement. There was the scathing United Nations report authored by James Anaya. There has been years of acrimonious litigation, roadblocks, and unresolved land claims. There has been the murdered and missing Aboriginal women. There has been an epidemic of Indigenous suicides. And there has been the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, all of these say the same thing, that the division between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada has grown deeper and more hostile since Confederation. The paradox here is that as this divide grows deeper, our common destiny binds us ever so tightly together by imperiling all of us. Put differently, the consequences of non-recognition have been harmful and costly to both Indigenous peoples and to all other Canadians. Disproportionate incarceration, suicide, poverty, high school dropout rates, lower life expectancy, poor health, unemployment, addictions, and an epidemic of suicides are too big a price to pay to maintain a status quo for Indigenous peoples that cannot be morally, ethically, or legally justified any longer. But before I sit down, I would like to share a story with you about reconciliation and recognition. A member of the South African Truth Commission, the Reverend Bongani Finta, told this story at a University of Calgary conference that I organized prior to the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this is how the story goes. There was a gentleman called Thabo, a black South African, who had a cow. One day, Mr. Smith, the white South African, with greater economic and political power, took Thabo's cow away from him without permission or compensation. Thabo suffered from the loss of the cow. He lost his livelihood, he became poor, He became depressed, and he couldn't provide proper housing for his children or get them the things that they needed to have a successful life. Many years later, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission brought Thabo and Mr. Smith together in a process of reconciliation. Mr. Smith offered an apology, and Thabo accepted it. They hugged, they kissed, they even had a cup of tea together. And they even shared a few jokes. At the end of the day, Mr. Smith got up to leave, and as he was going through the gate, Thabo asked, "Mr. Smith, what about the cow?" Mr. Smith said, "Thabo, you are messing this thing up about reconciliation. It's got nothing to do with the cow." I share this story because talking about the cow is where our commitment to reconciliation will be tested. Talking about the cow would mean being truthful about what divides us. It should mean talking about power, understanding who had power over the past, so as to determine who should have power over the present. As Frantz Fanon tells us, those who control power control the way history is framed, control the story and the reality that flows from it. Talking about the cow may mean giving the pen to the First Peoples to write the master narrative. Talking about the cow would mean honoring treaties then and self-determination rights, preserving dying Indigenous languages, strengthening Indigenous culture and traditions, sharing economic opportunities and appointing Indigenous Canadians to high positions of power, and recognizing the truth about Confederation. There could be no more important reconciliatory act, in my view. In other words, talking about the cow would lead to all of the things that should have been the history of Indigenous peoples in this country had they taken their rightful place at the Confederation table in 1867 as one of the three founding peoples. In conclusion, I have presented here I believe is a simple proposal. I believe the 150th anniversary of Confederation offers us an opportunity to finally tell the truth, that Canada is a country of three founding peoples. It will not end the suffering, it will not heal all the wounds or eradicate all the poverty. But what it will do is it will create a powerful narrative that will become part of the shared story of every Canadian for generations to come, and a platform for the construction of a nation-to-nation relationship with our Indigenous communities. To implement explicit statutory recognition or other forms will require consultation between the leadership of First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, the federal government, and the provinces. Implicit recognition already exists in the legislation and jurisprudence, so this will not be an unprecedented step. But reconciliation will not be easy. It is a multifaceted process that may take decades or generations to achieve, but it depends on attitudes and action. What is clear is that reconciliation will not be achieved unless a climate conducive to its realization is fostered. Recognizing the true place of Indigenous peoples in Canada's story of origin as equal partners in Confederation, I believe, will be a first step towards creating and nurturing that climate. I started my presentation with this slide. I think this one best represents my conclusion. Thank you for your attention. Miigwech.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for some very compelling and also ambitious presentation. Now we open the floor for questions. Please use a microphone in the back of the room and introduce yourself. And, vous pouvez poser vos questions en français ou en anglais. Je vais traduire si vous les posez en français. Donc, ne soyez pas gênés. Un sujet difficile, mais incontournable pour bâtir le pays que nous voulons bâtir. So Kathleen, to introduce to get back here for as we wait for people to ask their questions. But maybe I'll ask a question to get started. My son is called Riel, to recognize in our own family the importance of Métis and First Nation in our own family narrative. So I told him about the proposal. He's 15. So I can't exactly quote what he said for early morning breakfast, but essentially it means that it's like, of course, and then the so what? What does it mean in terms of dealing with the very real problems we're facing today?
I think that your son is very intuitive, and that's a very intelligent question. As I tried to make clear in my presentation, I think that setting the origin story straight and the importance of origin stories will provide a framework. I know a lot of people are thinking about a lot of ideas of how to commemorate the 150th anniversary. I hope we don't have to wait for another 50 years. It reminds me of maybe not everybody in this room can remember the last celebration at 100 years. When we celebrated Confederation, there was a huge gathering in Vancouver, about 35,000 people, to celebrate Confederation, and Chief Dan George, who was a very respected elder and chief at the time in Vancouver, got up to speak, and his speech sort of drove the whole celebration to a crashing halt, because he read a poem he had written called Lament for Confederation, saying how he wasn't celebrating Confederation. He was lamenting the non-recognition and the terrible plight that Indigenous peoples found themselves in. So I don't think we can underestimate the importance of origin stories as a starting point. And I know, as I said, there's lots of different projects being planned and ideas, but I think what this proposal would do is to provide the appropriate framework and the baseline. It's like a foundation upon which the nation-to-nation relationship can be constructed. And like anything that is built, you need a solid foundation, solid in law, solid in philosophical perspective, solid in history, before you can go on to create new relationships. And so, yes, it's not going to resolve all the problems immediately that your son would like to see and all of us would like to see, but I think it would put us on the right path.
Elke Winter, I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Ottawa here, and also a member of the Royal Society's College for New Scholars. Thank you very much for this inspiring and also heartbreaking talk. I was wondering if you could elaborate how important it is for you and the Commission that the recognition of Aboriginals is represented in the Canadian Oath for Citizenship. I asked this, I know this is a recommendation among many. It's probably not the most important one, but probably one that is, I think, could easily be achieved. And since we have Bill C6 in front of Parliament right now, I wonder if you could elaborate on the ideas behind that recommendation.
Well, I think that when you talk about citizenship and people becoming citizens, especially citizenship, I think, in newcomers to Canada, it's a profound awareness, I think, that new Canadians have to have is what are they buying into? What kind of a country is this? What is the makeup of the country? I think that's critical. Also, a lot of us here in this room are educators, and I think we understand the incredible importance of education. And as I said, this will become, if this proposal is adopted, the narrative will change about Canada and about how we teach our children and about how we celebrate all sorts of events, never mind just July the 1st. So, I think it's fundamental. I think it's fundamental to identity. It's fundamental to a sense of belonging. It's fundamental to citizenship. There's no question about that in my mind.
Hello. Thank you again for this talk. I work at Indigenous Affairs, and what I was thinking was interesting with the analogy of the cow. I think it's a great step to start talking about the cow, but where it gets interesting is the question of, are we willing to return the cow, or how far will we go in terms of sharing the profits of the cow? So talking is great. It's a good start.
Right.
How do we take it further?
Well, as I said in my talk, talking about the cow is well, you have to talk to come to some meaningful resolution, but I think it would have action connected with the talk. So talking about the cow would mean talking about, as I said, the truth of what divides us, and so much of that has to do with sharing in the resources of Canada, having treaties recognized and respected, which has all sorts of action attached to it as well, and preserving languages and cultures and putting programs in place so that that would happen, and so on and so forth. So talking about the cow is kind of a metaphor, I think, for action. Yes.
Hi, Kathleen. Gallery Renee Boston with the Federation. I actually just wanted to invite you to detail a little bit further what your proposal might look like. I recognize that part of what you meant is we need consultation to discuss with national Aboriginal organizations and parliamentarians what form formal recognition could take. But just it might be helpful for the MPs and others in the room. Sure. You were imagining a legislation or just a formal apology, or how would formal recognition look in the concrete?
Well, my vision would be a bill followed by a statute, because in that sense it would have full parliamentary attention. It will go through a committee process. It will go through the Senate. So in other words, there would be a full participatory process, which I believe is appropriate. There's other methods of doing this as well. Proclamation, for example, is what is behind the recognition of Aboriginal Day in Canada. A motion was used to recognize Québécois in Canada as a nation. My view is that if something is made formally and explicitly a statute, then I think I'm not recommending a constitutional amendment, because I don't think that's pragmatically possible. But having said that, we know that there's certain pieces of legislation that become quasi-constitutional over time. The Supreme Court Act being a very good example, and no government would ever repeal the Supreme Court Act, I wouldn't think. And similarly, I think that if there was a recognition of the founders of Canada being Indigenous, I think it would become a quasi-constitutional piece of legislation. So that would be my preferred vision, but there are other mechanisms that could be used that wouldn't have legal force, and I don't think that's necessarily the best way, but I would leave that to the experts in that field to discuss, and the leaders of the various Indigenous groups, along with leaders of our federal and provincial governments, to come to some resolution on that. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for the lecture, first of all. My name is Svetlana. I'm working as an intern at the House of Commons. I came from Ukraine, and as some of you may know, we also have a complicated situation with our indigenous people, with Crimean Tatars. And this has led me to a question. What do you think what government should do to establish this trustful relationship with indigenous people? Because proper legislation is good, but trust is something that cannot be earned by laws, that simply, and how long it might take. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. You're absolutely right. Legislation, we have legislation that is relatively meaningless because it's never enforced, which is not a good thing. I think that something like this would have to be taken very sincerely and very seriously by all those who participate in developing it. This isn't something which I think should be seen as just a rhetorical flourish or something that's just a minor blip in the history of the country. This is fundamental to what Canada is and who we are, and I think it should be taken with that level of seriousness. So it all depends on how Canadians would receive this and how it would be celebrated. This is why I think it's a perfect proposal to be celebrated at the 150th anniversary of Confederation. I mean, it begs the question, do we wait another 100 years? Do we wait 200 years? When is it going to be time to get our history straight and to set the record straight? And if it was part of a celebration such as this, it would carry with it much more significance to the country, in my view, because the whole country could celebrate around that concept. And it would have it could put a lot of meaning and substance to the recommendations of the TRC. The government in power has said that they're going to implement those recommendations. They're going to implement a nation-to-nation relationship. They're going to make things better. What better foundation upon which to build those promises than recognition of the true history of our country? I can't think of a better one.
Yeah, Professor Mahoney, I have a question.
Okay.
I wonder if you
I trust it's going to be an easy one.
Yeah, we talked about setting this up, by the way. I wonder if you could explain this notion of formal recognition. Because I'm sure that many people think that this is far too bold and might not be achievable within the year, because 2017 is not very far off. Speak to the notion of this particular matter as being part of a continuum.
Right.
And
okay, thank you for that question, Phil. Yes, as I said, I think that we have implicitly recognized Indigenous peoples as founders of the nation many times over through legislation and jurisprudence. Look at the Daniels case just decided a couple weeks ago. In fact, Justice Abella, there's a line in that decision that says, as time goes on, more and more Canadians are realizing that Indigenous peoples are founders of this nation. And she talks about the TRC and she talks about things like that. But if you consider the constitutional history in Canada, look at the Charlottetown Accord, look at Meech Lake, look at the discussions leading up to the Charter. All of those discussions, I mean, Meech Lake actually was a very important starting point, because the lesson was learned in this country that we can't enter into these kinds of discussions without participation from the leadership of Indigenous communities. And then there was Charlottetown, in which the Indigenous people were central to those negotiations. Sure, it didn't succeed. Nonetheless, they were at the table. So a pattern has been set in Canada that we can't do these kinds of fundamental building block events without participation of the Indigenous peoples. Look at the Clarity Act. Look at the Quebec reference case. All of those things have mentioned Indigenous peoples as being very, very important to the resolution of these constitutional issues. So implicitly, that recognition has occurred. It's explicit recognition that has yet to happen. So it's not that big of a leap, actually. I don't think parliamentarians should be afraid of this. It's the next step. And I think it should, I would think that it should go through Parliament unanimously. Why would you argue against such a thing when all these other building blocks are in place by the Supreme Court and also by the Parliament itself? Over the years and things that it's done to recognize the reality that we live in a country with Indigenous peoples as the first peoples.
Hi. What I have to say is just a little bit of a comment and then a question at the end. My son is third year university in Montreal, and he's working, this is his third year working at the Sir Georges Etienne Cartier heritage site in the old port of Montreal. And what his job is, what his project is because he is, Georges Etienne Cartier was seen as the one of the founders of Canada. His project is to explain to visitors how he actually built Canada, what his contribution was, and have people come in and write sort of a little narrative of what their idea of a perfect Canada would be. Mm-hmm. And I was listening very attentively to what you had to say, and I'm so much in agreement with it. But then on the other hand, I see my son is promoting, the other story. Mm-hmm. And I know when I talk to him about this, he'll be like, "Oh my gosh, Mom." So I'm just wondering, like, this is all towards the 2017 150th anniversary, but we're kind of running out of time, and I really think this is a story that should be told. And so he's working for Heritage Canada and Parks Canada. And so do you think, is there a way that he could, or should he speak up at this point to help change the story that he's telling this year, his third year in the job? Thanks.
Thank you for that. Well, nobody's denying that the French and the British didn't make a contribution. That's, the contribution is very important to our country. It's more in finishing the story, including the huge contributions that the massive contribution that the Indigenous peoples made. And it seems to me any story that you're telling visitors about Canada is seriously deficient. And your son's a university student. Seems to me that he's well placed to say, look, this is what the story is. Maybe my narrative here that I've got in my hand, that I've been given from somebody, I don't have to follow that. I wouldn't think he would say to himself, if I know differently, and tell people that ask questions, or he's giving them the story. This is what happened here. And sure, Cartier played a huge role, and so did the other founders. But we wouldn't be here today living the way we do and the prosperity that we have without the massive contribution of Indigenous peoples. And I think that has to be told, and I think we have to take it on board as Canadians to do it, whether we're in the tourism industry or whether we are parliamentarians or whether we're educators at universities or in schools. I think it's critical.
Wow. I would like to thank Kathleen for joining us today. She's, I think, conveyed with this deep sense of urgency, deep sense of justice of what Canada can be. So I like to thank you for such a valuable insight, for bringing in so much of the humanities and social science and law into your presentation and into such a timely and important topic for us as Canadians. So I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation for taking the time to be with us today. And it's also a book about survival and resilience, about what justice can look like. So thank you very much. Thank you, Kathleen. Je veux également remercier nos partenaires, la Société royale du Canada, pour s'associer avec nous pour amener Kathleen ici à Ottawa aujourd'hui. Merci encore au CRSH pour leur soutien précieux tout au long de cette série. Merci encore à Greg Ferguson, député parrain de la série de Côte d'Ivoire Grand. And thank you all for joining us for today's conversation with Kathleen. A video of a presentation will be shortly available on the Federation website. And also, a summary presentation, there will be an op-ed from Kathleen on the Globe and Mail website available at noon today. So feel free to share, use Twitter, make that story, that proposal known. Time, as people mentioned, time is running out to make it real for 2017, so we're counting on your support. This concludes our 2016 Big Thinking Thinking on the Hill program, but we hope you're going to be joining us for our next Big Thinking lecture on September 27, so put it in your calendar, where we'll have Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society and a board member of the Federation, talking about 6 months after the Human Rights Tribunal decision, what is happening and what should be done in terms of providing equal services to all children in Canada, including children from First Nations. So we hope to see you there. And beyond big thinking on the hill, the Federation brings big thinking to our annual Congress of Humanities and Social Science, which is taking place in Calgary this year at the end of May. So despite the events happening at Fort Mac, we want people to come to Calgary because the Congress is going to be the second largest event after the Oil and Gas Convention taking place in Calgary this year. It's a very concrete part of being part of the recovery program, but also of bring oxygen to national conversation, like Kathleen has done today, it's whether you can be there in present or also through Twitter or some of the presentation will be available on the website. So I urge you to be part of this conversation as well. Donc merci et bonne journée à tous et je vous souhaite une belle journée de printemps. Merci.